The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Marguerite Forsham later thought, a deeply ordinary day to have one's entire life decided without one's knowledge or consent. She had been in the kitchen of their rented rooms in Edinburgh, attempting to stretch a pot of barley soup into something that might serve as both luncheon and supper, when she heard her father's voice change, not rise. He never raised his voice, which was somehow worse. It simply went flat, the way ice goes flat just before it cracks. She set down the ladle. Through the thin wall she could hear two voices. Her father's and another man's, slower, with the particular patience of someone accustomed to delivering news that ruins things. She did not go in. She stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides and waited. And when the front door finally closed and the room went quiet, she counted to 10 before walking through. Her father, Gerald Forsham, was sitting in the chair nearest the window. He was still holding the document. His knuckles were white. "Papa!" He looked up. Something in his face made her stomach drop. "We're done," he said. "Harwick House. It's gone." Harwick House had never felt like a place that could be lost. That was the problem with houses you grew up in. You assumed they were permanent in the way mountains were permanent, in the way the North Sea was permanent. Marguerite had spent the first 17 years of her life in those stone halls, had learned to read in the library with its south-facing windows, had memorized every creak in the staircase, every draft that slipped under the blue bedroom door in January. Her grandfather had built it. Her mother had been married from it. Her mother had also died in it, which Marguerite supposed was the sort of detail that made a place yours in the truest sense. When her grandfather died, the house and the attached estate in Northumberland had passed not to her father, but to the estate in trust, a complicated arrangement designed, as far as Marguerite could ever understand it, to prevent exactly the kind of financial catastrophe that her father had nevertheless managed to engineer over the following decade. Investments. Poor ones. A business venture in Glasgow that had collapsed inside of 2 years. A loan taken from the wrong man at the wrong time. The trust had been the last protection, and now a solicitor had come to Edinburgh on a Tuesday in March to explain that the trust had been dissolved, the debts called in, and the estate transferred to settle what was owed. "To whom?" Marguerite asked. Her father's jaw worked. "A man named Devereux." "I don't know that name." "No, neither did I until 6 months ago." He finally set the document down on the table. He bought the debt, all of it, from 3 separate creditors, and then he called it in simultaneously. Marguerite looked at the document. She did not touch it. "That wasn't an accident," she said. Her father said nothing, which was answer enough. She learned what she could about Rowan Devereux in the weeks that followed, which was both more and less than she expected. He was the 4th Earl of Strath, a Scottish title, old money attached to a large estate in the Borders, the kind of wealth that had been accumulating quietly for 200 years, and therefore attracted very little attention. He was 34. He had never married. He had, by all accounts, no particular interest in society, which was perhaps why Marguerite had never encountered his name, despite moving in the same general stratum of English and Scottish gentry for most of her life. What she could not learn was why he had wanted Harwick House specifically. He had 12,000 acres in the Borders. He had a house in Edinburgh and a flat in London. He had no apparent connection to Northumberland, no family ties she could trace, no history with the Forsham name. She asked her father directly. "I don't know," he said, and she believed him, which made it worse. She went back to stretching the soup and thinking, and what she concluded, eventually, was this: she was not going to simply accept it. The position was advertised in a notice board at the employment office near Waverley Station. Housekeeper's assistant, Harwick House, Northumberland, must have experience with large household management. References required. Marguerite had no references. She had, however, grown up in Harwick House and knew its inventory, its seasonal rhythms, its small disasters. The east wing gutter that needed clearing every autumn, the boiler temperament in the lower kitchen, the precise location of every damp patch in every ceiling, better than any housekeeper could from a decade of employment. She borrowed the name from her mother's side of the family, Marguerite Linwood. She wrote herself a reference from a house in Edinburgh whose housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carver, had died the previous year and could neither confirm nor deny anything. She felt a small and specific guilt about this, which she noted and then set aside. She was 26 years old, her father was living on the charity of a distant cousin, and someone had deliberately dismantled her family in order to take a house. She was not prepared to be entirely scrupulous about it. The interview was conducted by letter. The reply came in less than a week, which surprised her. She had expected to be refused on some basis she hadn't anticipated. Instead, the letter was brief and businesslike. She was to present herself at Harwick House on the 14th of April. Her accommodation and meals would be provided. Her wages were listed. They were, she noted with some bitterness, more than adequate. She packed one trunk. She did not tell her father exactly what she was doing, because he would have tried to stop her, and she did not have the patience for it. The coaching road to Northumberland was long, and the spring was not yet warm. Marguerite sat with her coat buttoned to the throat and watched the landscape change from the compressed gray geometry of Edinburgh to something wider and older-looking, moorland and pale sky and hedgerows just beginning to green. She had expected to feel something approaching grief when the house came into view. She had prepared herself for it. What she had not prepared for was how entirely unchanged it looked. Same stone, same long windows with their southern aspect, same copper beech at the west corner that had been planted by her grandfather and was now twice the height she remembered it. The kitchen garden wall needed repointing. That was new. But otherwise, standing at the end of the gravel drive in the April afternoon, it was so unchanged that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Then the front door opened, and a woman came out to meet her, and Marguerite arranged her face into something professional and calm. "Miss Linwood?" The woman was perhaps 50, with a key ring at her hip and the particular economy of movement that came from managing a large house for decades. "I'm Mrs. Farrow, the housekeeper. His lordship will not be in residence until Thursday, so I'll have time to show you the house properly before he arrives." Marguerite followed her inside and said nothing and looked at the entrance hall, the same tiles, the same staircase, the painting of the lock that had hung on the east wall since before she was born, and thought with a steadiness that surprised her, "I am going to find out what he did and why, and I am going to undo it." Mrs. Farrow was competent and not unkind. She showed Marguerite the house in the methodical way of someone who had done it before. Noting what had changed under the new ownership, not much. The library had been catalogued, some furniture rearranged in the drawing room, and what had stayed the same, most things. She did not seem to find it strange that Marguerite moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who had lived there, because she attributed it to professional experience. Marguerite let her. The staff were small for a house of that size. Mrs. Farrow, a cook named Bess, whose surname Marguerite never caught clearly, 2 housemaids, a footman, a groundskeeper who came in 3 days a week. Lord Strath, apparently, kept a lean household. "He's not often here," Mrs. Farrow said, in the tone of someone explaining a weather pattern. "The Borders estate is where he spends most of his time. He comes to Harwick for the grouse season, usually, and occasionally in spring." "Why?" Marguerite asked, and then caught herself. "I mean, the house is large for occasional visits." Mrs. Farrow gave her a slightly appraising look. "I couldn't say. He doesn't explain his arrangements to me." Marguerite noted this. She noted everything. He arrived on Thursday afternoon, a day before she'd been told to expect him, which she later thought was characteristic, punctuality as a form of unpredictability. She was in the linen room counting pillowcases when she heard the carriage on the gravel and then voices in the entrance hall. She stayed where she was. There was no reason to present herself immediately. Mrs. Farrow would handle the arrival. She finished counting the pillowcases. She was not in a hurry. She met him for the first time at dinner, not as a guest, but standing near the doorway of the dining room while Mrs. Farrow made introductions. He was taller than she'd pictured, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it gave away precisely as much as it had intended to and nothing more. He looked at her the way one looks at a new member of staff, briefly, correctly, with no particular curiosity. "Miss Linwood," he said, "Mrs. Farrow speaks well of you." "Thank you, my lord. I trust you're finding the house manageable." "Very much so." He nodded and turned back to whatever papers he'd brought to the table with him. Another characteristic, she would learn, the habit of working through dinner when he was alone, and that was the entire conversation. She went back to the linen room. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She was proud of that. The first week was useful mainly for observation. Lord Strath kept early hours and late ones both. He was often in the library before anyone else was properly awake, and often still there when the household went to bed. He ate simply and had no interest in ceremony. He did not appear to socialize. No visitors came, no letters arrived that seemed personal in nature. He moved through the house with a kind of precision, as if he had memorized it, which was odd in a man who supposedly spent very little time there. Marguerite catalogued this. She catalogued everything. What she was looking for, specifically, were the estate papers, any documentation of the acquisition, the debt arrangements, the legal transfer. She needed to understand the mechanism of what her father's solicitor had described, because understanding the mechanism was the first step toward finding whether there was any flaw in it, any point at which something had been done improperly or under false pretense. The library was the obvious place to start, but the library was also where Lord Strath spent most of his time. She began finding reasons to be in the library. He noticed on the fourth day, which was faster than she'd expected. She was dusting the upper shelves, a genuinely necessary task, since the previous staff had been somewhat neglectful of the higher reaches. When she heard him set down his pen, "Miss Linwood, my lord, are the upper shelves in need of particular attention today?" She looked down at him from the ladder. His expression was exactly what it always was, contained, measuring, giving away precisely nothing. "The spring dusting hasn't been done," she said. "Mrs. Farrow asked me to begin with the rooms in most frequent use." "I see." He picked up his pen again. "Try not to drop anything on my correspondence." "I'll do my best, my lord." She went back to dusting. She was careful not to glance at the papers on his desk, even though they were entirely visible from her position on the ladder. And even though one of them had the word Forsham printed in the upper corner, in letters she could read from 6 feet away. She did not look. She climbed down with the duster and left the room and stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing. Then she went back to work. The document she eventually found was not in the library at all. It was in a box in the estate office, which was not locked. Lord Strath apparently did not feel the need to lock things, which was either confidence or carelessness, and she hadn't yet determined which. She found it on a Tuesday afternoon in her third week, when she'd been asked to clean the office in preparation for a meeting with the local land agent. She was quick about it. She read what she needed to read and replaced it exactly as she'd found it, and she went back to her other tasks, and that evening she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room that had once been a guest room for her mother's friends and thought about what she'd learned. The debt had been real. She'd suspected it might not be, that there'd been some fraud, some manufactured obligation. But no, her father's debts were genuine and documented and substantial. There was nothing improper in the way Lord Strath had acquired them. What there was, however, was a letter, a single letter folded into the back of the document file from a firm of solicitors in Edinburgh, dated 2 years ago, addressed not to Devereux Rowan, Earl of Strath, but to Rowan Devereux as a private individual. The letter was about a clause in her grandfather's original trust, a clause that the Edinburgh solicitors were apparently advising Lord Strath had been improperly drafted, which meant, if they were correct, that the trust's dissolution and the resulting transfer of Harwick House might be legally contestable. He had known for 2 years, before he bought the debt, before he called it in. He had taken the house knowing there was a legitimate question about whether he had the right to. She did not sleep particularly well after that. She had been so certain of his guilt, had come here expecting to find it, had prepared herself for anger, and now she found something more complicated and considerably harder to manage. Not fraud, not theft, exactly. Something more like calculated risk on his part, with her family's home as the prize if the risk paid off, and the clause turned out not to matter. She needed a solicitor of her own. She needed to understand whether the clause her grandfather's lawyers had drafted was actually contestable, or whether the Edinburgh firm's advice had been wrong, or whether Lord Strath had already had it quietly resolved somewhere in the 2 years since the letter was written. She needed, in other words, to talk to someone, and she was alone in a house that was no longer hers, under a false name, with no one she could trust. She had breakfast with the kitchen staff at 6 o'clock the next morning and passed the marmalade when asked and said nothing about any of it. It was Bess, the cook, who inadvertently broke something open. Bess had a niece in Alnwick whose husband was a solicitor, a small-town practice, wills and property disputes, nothing grand. And she mentioned this one morning in the way people mention things in kitchens, not for any particular reason, just filling air. Marguerite asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the niece's husband knew anything about trust law. Bess looked at her with the expression of someone who has noticed rather more than they've been given credit for. "For a friend?" Bess said. "For a general understanding," Marguerite said. Bess gave her a day off the following week and the address of a Mr. Hadley Crane in Alnwick, and said nothing more about it, which was perhaps the single most useful thing anyone had done for Marguerite in 6 months. Mr. Crane was a quiet man with the manner of someone who had seen a great many complicated family situations and no longer found them surprising. He listened to Marguerite's explanation. She was careful. She described the situation in general terms, said she was asking on behalf of a family member, and he confirmed what she had already half concluded. The clause was contestable. It was genuinely improperly drafted, a specific language requirement that her grandfather's solicitors had failed to meet, probably through oversight, the kind of error that happened in long legal documents when everyone assumed someone else had checked the specific wording. If the clause was challenged in the right court, the dissolution of the trust could potentially be reversed. Potentially, Mr. Crane said carefully, and I emphasize the word. It would depend on how aggressively it was pursued, whether the current holder of the property chose to contest, and the sympathy of whoever was hearing the case. It is not a certainty, but it's possible. It is possible. She thanked him and took the coaching road back to Harwick, and sat in the lurching carriage watching the moor go by and thought, so Lord Strath knew this and took the house anyway, and has presumably been sitting in the library at Harwick House for the past 3 weeks, knowing that the woman assisting his housekeeper might have a legal claim to it, except, of course, that he didn't know who she was. He thought she was Marguerite Linwood. She had a decision to make. She made it on a Friday evening, when the household was quiet and Lord Strath was alone in the library with whatever correspondence he'd had forwarded from Edinburgh. She knocked. "Come." She opened the door and did not go all the way in, stood in the threshold, which felt somehow important, maintaining the option of the hallway behind her. "Miss Linwood." He looked up from his papers. "Is something the matter?" "I have something to tell you," she said, "and I'd like to do it before I've thought about it long enough to talk myself out of it." He set down his pen. He gave her his full attention, which was, she'd noticed, something he did completely when he chose to. None of the half-distracted listening that most people defaulted to. All of him focused. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "My name is not Marguerite Linwood," she said. "It's Marguerite Forsham. Gerald Forsham was my father. This is my family's house." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of someone reorganizing information they already had into a different configuration. He said finally. "I know." She kept her voice steady. She'd practiced this. "I'm not here to make accusations. I found the letter from the Edinburgh solicitors. I know what it says about the trust clause. I went to Alnwick last week and had it independently assessed." "And what were you told?" "That it's contestable. That I may have grounds to challenge the transfer." She looked at him directly. "I'm not telling you this to threaten you, my lord. I'm telling you because sitting in this house under a false name and waiting for an opportunity to go through your papers seemed, on reflection, a worse way to conduct myself than simply saying it plainly." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. "How long have you known about the clause?" she asked. 2 years and 4 months, and you took the house anyway." "Yes." He didn't soften it or explain it. She found, to her own surprise, that she respected that. "Why did you want it?" she asked. "You have your own estate. You have more land than you could manage in a lifetime. Why Harwick specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and walked to the window that faced the Copar beach, her grandfather's tree enormous in the spring twilight, and she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My mother grew up near here," he said. "Not in this house. In a smaller one about 4 miles east that no longer exists. She used to walk to this estate when she was a girl. She described it to me, often." He paused. "She died when I was 12. I inherited the earldom at 22 and spent the next decade acquiring things, which I think is what one does when one doesn't know how else to manage it." Marguerite looked at him standing at the window. She thought about her own mother, who had died in the East Wing, and her own habit of moving through the rooms cataloging things as if inventory could stand in for presents. She said, "That's not a good reason." "No," he agreed, without turning. "It isn't. It also doesn't resolve the question of the trust clause." "No." He turned then. "It doesn't." He looked at her in the same way he had when she'd come to announce herself, completely, measuring. But something in it was different now. "I'd like to propose something. I want to speak with my solicitors in Edinburgh, with full transparency about the clause and its implications. I'd like you to be present for those conversations, or at least to have access to the correspondence. And I'd like a third party, someone neither of us has engaged, to assess the legal question independently and come to their own conclusions." She stared at him. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I took something I may not have had the right to take, and I'd like to know, with certainty, whether I did or not." He picked up his pen from the desk. "And because you could have gone to a solicitor and filed a challenge without ever telling me who you were or why you were here. The fact that you didn't suggests a preference for honesty that I'd like to meet appropriately." It was not simple after that. Nothing about it was simple. The independent assessment took 3 months, during which Marguerite remained at Harwick House in a status that was neither employed nor guest exactly. A strange in-between, which Mrs. Pharaoh accepted with the adaptability of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by how complicated the gentry could make things. Lord Strath went back to the borders for 6 weeks in June and returned in July, and in his absence, Marguerite walked through the house at night sometimes, the way she had as a child, running her fingers along the wainscoting in the dark. The assessment concluded, in the careful language of legal opinion, that the trust clause was indeed improperly drafted, that a challenge was feasible, and that the likely outcome in court would favor the Forsham estate's position. Lord Strath received the report on a Thursday morning. He read it at the dining room table, and Marguerite sat across from him, and the house was very quiet. He set it down. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the copper beech moved in the August wind, its leaves making the sound she had grown up with, a specific rustling she associated with every summer of her childhood. "I'll speak to my solicitor about restoring the title," he said. "It will take some time to arrange, but it's straightforward enough given what Crane has concluded." Marguerite said carefully, "You don't have to. I'm aware. The assessment is an opinion, not a judgment. A court might decide differently. You could contest it. I could." He looked out the window at the tree. "Your grandfather planted that beech, yes. When my grandmother was expecting my father." He nodded slowly. Then he looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the most readable she had ever seen it. Not unguarded exactly, but honest. The face of someone who has finished calculating and arrived at a conclusion they've decided not to argue with. "The house should be yours," he said. "It was always going to be yours. I just didn't want to know that for a while." There are people who say that things happen for reasons, and Marguerite had always found this either comforting or infuriating depending on the day. She was not the sort of person who believed suffering arranged itself into meaningful patterns. She believed, more practically, that you could sometimes find the thread that led out, and that finding it required staying very still and looking carefully. She stayed at Harwick House through the autumn while the legal arrangements progressed. Lord Strath visited twice, for short periods, and on both occasions was courteous and specific, and left her alone when she needed to be left alone, which she found she appreciated more than she would have predicted. He wrote her a letter from the borders in November. It was businesslike in the way all his communications were businesslike, covering the solicitor's timeline and some specifics about the estate accounts. But at the end, after the signature, there was a single line. "I hope the east wing gutter has been attended to before the first heavy rain. I noticed it was overdue in April." She read this 3 times. Then she sat down at the desk in the library, her library now or returning to being so, and wrote back. She told him the gutter had been cleared in September. She told him that Bess had made her position permanent, at her own insistence, which Marguerite had accepted gratefully. She told him that the copper beech had turned a spectacular color before it dropped its leaves, and that she had stood under it for a long time on an afternoon in October. Then, at the end, after her signature, she wrote, "If you are in the area in spring, the house is always open to you. You knew where the gutter needed fixing before I did. That counts for something." She sealed it and posted it, and went back to the kitchen, where Bess was making a pot of soup that smelled of barley and something else, something warm and unnameable. Marguerite took the ladle when it was offered and stirred, and outside the Northumberland autumn was finishing itself out in gray and gold, and the house was very steady around her, the way houses are when they have been waited for a long time, and are finally, unmistakably, home.